Good morning. My name is Doug Nesbitt. I'm with Extron, and I want to welcome you to Extron's webinar entitled New Paradigms in Supply Chain Design. This is part of the Supply Chain Game Changers series of webinars, and we're holding those webinars monthly. We hope you'll join us for all of them. This is the first of the series, and we have many, many more exciting webinars scheduled, usually at the beginning of each month coming forward. So be sure to look forward to announcements of future webinars, and Sandeep, our presenter, will mention those as he goes along as well. As I mentioned, today's presenter is Sandeep Duggal, Chief Executive Officer of Extron. Sandeep has served as CEO of Extron since 2002. He's responsible for setting and executing the company's strategy, business development, and overall company performance. Prior to joining Extron, Mr. Duggal worked at Sun Micro, Intel Company, and the Monitor Company. Mr. Duggal holds an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, a graduate degree in industrial engineering, engineering management from Stanford University, and an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School at Harvard University. If you have any questions during the presentation, we highly encourage questions. Please send them using the question function on your GoToMeeting control panel. And we're going to cover all those questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll hang around as long as necessary so Mr. Duggal can answer those questions as we go along. And further, if you want to schedule an individual discussion with Sandeep, please do send an email directly to him. His contact information is going to be at the end of the presentation. We hope you'll reach out to him at any point in time after the presentation. Again, we highly encourage questions at the end. This is really meant to be sort of a two-way dialogue. Please do hang around as long as you have time, and we can have a conversation about any aspect of the presentation. And during the presentation, he'll also talk a little bit about some of the future webinars that we'll be doing. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sandeep. Let me see if I can switch control here, and we will be up and running here. And I'm going to make you the presenter, Sandeep, and away we go. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Doug. I first of all want to say I appreciate very much so many of you taking time out of your mornings or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I appreciate the fact that the interest that's coming up in the supply chain right now. Supply chain has always been a hot area, and increasingly so with some of the changes that we're going to discuss in today's webinar. So with that, we'll proceed with the actual presentation. But thank you very much, and thanks very much for the kind intro, Doug. So we're talking today about new paradigms in supply chain design. This is the first of a series of webinars that's intended to educate listeners across the United States and Canada for the most part, but really the target audience is companies that are producing products in offshore locations, but primarily have markets in other parts in the developed world, far away from their factories. So to put a quick agenda together, give you a quick sense of where we're going, we're going to talk a little bit about historical perspective, what has changed in the supply chain, thinking through the current model, and then presenting a portion of the last mile supply chain model. I got to emphasize that what I'm going to be showing you today is a portion of the last mile supply chain model. There's several other pieces that it would just be too much to introduce it in one webinar, and that's why we're going to break this up into 4 different series. So, and then finally questions, and as Doug answered, hopefully some good answers too. So let's talk a little bit about a historical perspective on outsourcing and supply chain. Really, what happened in the initially in supply, when manufacturing first got started, organized manufacturing first got started, was operations were all internal. Think of the old blacksmith who had a product, and well, he found his own foundry and manufactured his own product. Now, fast forwarding a little bit now to the 20th century, think of companies, technology companies primarily, that did their own manufacturing, set up their own PCB shops, had their own final assembly, did their own distribution. Many of us, I think, who've been in the workforce for 20 years or longer, recall companies like that, with the switch finally getting made late in the 1980s, all the way through late in the 1990s for the late adopters, to leveraged or outsourced operations. Now, this was proceeded very rapidly from leveraged and outsourced operations to globalized operations. The globalized change to globalized operations began happening in the 80s, very soon after the whole outsourcing boom happened in technology. And by the way, I'm going to gear this whole presentation towards technology because that is largely our focus. But the message over here, I think, can be taken away from not just for the technology industry, but it applies to a whole host of other a whole host of other industries. So globalization was then the next thing. Now I think we've entered stage 4, which is where people have gone through globalization, realized its limitations, and are now seeking to fine-tune the model. I got to emphasize that if there was a cost reduction, efficiency gains, whatever you like to call them, whatever euphemism you like to use, about 80% of those cost reductions and productivity gains were achieved through globalization. By moving through stage 4, the optimization is a much smaller number. However, it is enough to make a big competitive difference. I want to emphasize that there are companies whom we already do work with, among them Dell, General Electric, that are already adopting, using this model, in this case with Extron, but I know there are companies outside of Extron that use this new model that we're going to expose you to today. So optimization is where we currently are, and I do know that there's going to be a stage 5 and a stage 6 probably. Don't know what those look like right now, but time will tell. We have a sense of where this might go. So what I want you to take away from this is that there's an inexorable move to the right with time, obviously. Nobody stops time. But then a move up towards these different stages. So that's your brief historical perspective. And now let's talk a little further about the current supply chain model that has resulted from this. So I'd ask you to think of the supply chain in 2 different phases, if you will. A globalized piece, and then a second piece that can be global or local. Typically, distribution tends to be local, but not always. I know companies that do their distribution out of Singapore and do their distribution out of Guangdong or Shenzhen or wherever. Field engineering and service pools, warranty pools, advanced replacement pools, these are things that typically tend to be local. Returns could be local or global. So it's this last half of the supply chain that it tends to have hybrids, but the first half of the supply chain tends to be fairly globalized. Okay, so this is today's model, and there's when I say globalized, there are portions of a globalized supply chain that can absolutely be local. So component suppliers tend to be concentrated in a globalized market. Looking at this in a high-tech context alone, the PCB manufacturers are located fairly close proximity to the component suppliers, meaning a short flight away, or they're moving fairly small parts around. And the PCB assemblers are typically doing final configuration, transporting the product by air or ocean to distribution centers and spares distribution centers located either globally or located in the market, eventually shipping products to the end customer here. So now, if you look at where these arrows are, the 3 vertical arrows, you'll see that the key interfaces from the OEM here on the top are to the contract manufacturer, oftentimes to the freight provider, but that's not always the case, and always, of course, to the customer. You won't see much else. There's obviously some kind of a link from the OEM, from the customer to the OEM, and then down to the distribution center. But there's really not much other activity. Manufacturing in today's high-tech organization is largely been reduced to a core of a handful of people running, in some cases, a multi-hundred million dollar, multi-billion dollar supply chain with a very small group of people. Now, last thing I want to bring up is the origin typically has low labor costs, high concentration of component suppliers, and the market, especially today, has fairly volatile demand, a lot of configuration activity, and fairly significant pre- and post-sale logistical activity. And I'm going to use logistics in a very broad sense over here. So, rushing through this historical perspective, let me now move then to what has changed. The point is, this little graphic of a ship moving across the water, there's always been rocks underneath the water. The issue has been the water mark has been very high. People have never really faced the rocks. That has begun to change. The water level has begun to fall. These rocks are now getting exposed. And let's talk about what those change drivers are. So this now, fast forwarding to today, and talking about three categories of change drivers: economic, knowledge, and geopolitical change. So let's cover these in, very, very briefly. First, address the economic changes. First, we know there's been significant wage changes in Asia. We're seeing these. We hear about these in the news. We see them in products coming in from Asia in some cases. Second, there's been decreasing wages over here. I'll just ask you at some point, and we could do this right now, but we just don't have the time, extrapolate the minimum wage in the U.S. from the 1980s, run a 3% CAGR over the 20-year period, and see where you end up in. And I'll tell you something, that it certainly isn't $7.50 or $9 or even $9.25, which is the minimum wage here in California. You just simply don't hit those kinds of numbers. Another little anecdote for this: in Germany, one of widely known to be one of the more expensive Western economies, even more than the U.S., real wages have actually fallen 10% in the last 10 years. It's a shocking statistic when I tell people, especially given how unionized Germany is. In the U.S., that number is only larger, except it's not published. It can be calculated, and like I said, I'll leave that exercise to you. Third thing, oil prices are up. That results in transportation costs and so on. Exchange rates are changing daily. The RMB, the Thai baht, the rupee, all these currencies, when viewed in the context of a 10-year change, have actually appreciated drastically vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. This year alone, the RMB has appreciated 6%. Now let's talk a little bit about knowledge. Business economics are better understood right now. People understand what it means to outsource. People understand what it means to outsource globally, to Asia specifically. There have been significant IP leakage experience, not only on software, which is the people with IP that is software like Microsoft and those kinds of guys, but I'm talking about hardware companies that have had to put their IP overseas because that's what you manufacture, and are seeing their IP unwittingly and in some cases wittingly taken. We'll talk about that a little bit further. We'll talk about it actually just in a couple of minutes when we talk about changing regulations and IP. There's new realities with respect to business ethics. Travel, certainly. Those of you that have been on planes know what that's like and how difficult that is. And that is, believe it or not, very costly for all businesses. And acute awareness of business interruption. We just have to go back to, I believe it was May, when we had the Japanese earthquake, and we have to go back to last week when we think about the Thai flooding. And we know what's happened to companies all the way from automakers to Western Digital to Seagate, who've seen the operations interrupted. Now, when we put on this geopolitical change and how government is now beginning to perceive some Asian countries not as cheap sources of labor that we can outsource to, but to actual rivals, you can see where government, specifically the U.S. government, which the European governments are getting into the picture, being very concerned about the rise of these foreign countries and them actually rivaling U.S. or European dominance. There's certainly a Buy American trend in the U.S., and I can assure you there's exactly the same thing going on in some economies in Europe. Security concerns after 9/11 have changed the game quite a bit. And finally, changing regulations in overseas regimes. I'll just bring up to you that recent factories that have been put up in China, there have been explicit requirements by the Chinese government to say, you've got to transfer the IP, you've got to build here, there's got to be majority control of the factory. These, I would suggest to you, are not simply control, but they're actually part of a broader technology transfer agenda that exists in some of these countries. I'm not going to fault anybody for that. Technology transfer is a legitimate demand. Technology transfer has been taking place for hundreds of years. The British, let's not forget, transferred cotton weaving technology to these little colony in a third world country, as far as they were concerned, called the United States back in the 1600s. So technology transfer through regulation is not an unexpected one. However, I think it's really a situation of transferee beware. And that is one of the key takeaways I want you to take away from this webinar. All right, so the impact of change that we talked about, and sorry to rush through those, but we've got a lot of material to cover, is those rocks are now exposed. The ship is now sailing across the water with some serious rocks, and guess what? It just can't get over them. Now, these risks that were marked are now evident, and I'm going to skip over these very quickly. There's excessive inventory. That's a new reality that's become aware. There's an understanding of distant supply chain having larger lead time. There is a clear understanding of admin costs, large minimum efficient volumes, freight cost escalation, and then certain origin risks also, which is increasing labor costs, exchange rate dependency, concentration risk with respect to a large vendor. Specifically, I would argue that many of the people actually on this webinar, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to attend again, have vendors that are probably similar, in some cases many, many times the size of your OEM. I don't really, I'm not going to pretend to not hurt sensibilities over here, but when you've got a really large vendor and they're much bigger than you, well, we clearly understand where the power lies in that relationship. And if you're IBM, it's one thing, but if you're a multi-$100 million company or your size relative to the large global CMs is quite different. There's obviously concentration risk geographically, there's obviously IP, we talked about that. And then there's foreign contracts and recourse. We can spend a lot of time talking about these risks and changes. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to skim ahead and please hold any questions for the end. So the resulting problems are flexibility. People are now realizing that it's tough to respond to market volatility. You need A, you order B. While you get your Bs in the market, your Bs can be changed to A, but there's cost. You have to account for changing customer behavior, rapid response, and basically being adaptable to a, instead of being the hare, you're now the tortoise depicted in this picture. Second, costs. There are hidden costs, there are increasing costs, and there are balance sheet issues. Specifically inventory, asset utilization. When you've got a longer supply chain, those are issues. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not advocating at all that companies magically shut down and move all their operations back to the U.S. In fact, that would be economic suicide. I just want to be very clear about that. But we're highlighting some issues with an overseas supply chain that we're going to address as part of this webinar series. I'm in fact going to get pretty deep into just today. Please bear in mind costs and economics, specifically income statements and costs, and asset utilization. Read into that inventory, especially on highly configurable product. Okay? And these are hidden, they are increasing. Third thing, IP leakage, we talked about this at length, I don't need to get into that extensively. And finally, sourcing risk, we talked about vendor leverage, geographic concentration. And these are what we're going to address. These are the 4 problems we're going to address in the 4 upcoming webinars. That are going to be in December, January, February, March, and beyond. So we'll get into these in very deep dive in future webinars, but today we're going to be covering at a very high level and then getting a little bit deeper into what we call the last mile supply chain. The key here is how maneuverable. That big ship was going to crash into those rocks. Can we develop a ship that changes into an aeroplane or a dolphin that is able to maneuver over these rocks and become what we call an adaptive supply chain? That is our big view of this. And how this happens is through rethinking supply chain architecture. Number 1, think of the supply chain in 2 components. Think of it as a globalized piece. Remember, we talked about the globalized piece in one of the early slides. And then think about it in terms of a last mile piece also, which is a more localized piece. And this together becomes what we call a local supply chain. Again, I want to emphasize, we're not advising that anybody run wholesale, drop their Chinese contract manufacturer or their Thai contract manufacturer or their Indian contract manufacturer. No, within that context, we have to reduce the power of some of those subcontractors. We have to make our supply chain more adaptive and give ourselves as manufacturing and supply chain managers more tools to control this with. So adding control at every step through the AVL, subcontractors, component suppliers, geographical concerns, and provide ourselves with several levers that don't exist in today's model. So let's talk about that new model, right? We wanted to be more flexible because we got a flexibility issue. We wanted to be structurally secure, protect our company's IP so that we're not unwittingly creating mini competitors that, even if it's not happening purposely, we are transferring technology to overseas economies where people can say, hey, I can do this for less because I don't have to invest in developing IP, and all of a sudden you've created a manufacturer, networking manufacturer, a consumer goods manufacturer that is a competitor to you because you've unwittingly transferred technology. Third, we need to do this analysis based on landed cost. Folks, in the 80s, transportation was considered cost of doing business. It was expensed as a period cost. It's no longer a period cost. It's much too large. I'm sure all of you have your CFOs breathing down your neck because freight costs can be anywhere from 3 or 4% all the way up to 15% of cost of goods sold with an overseas supply chain. I've seen both ends of the range, and you have to look at your supply chain based on total landed cost. You have to make it less volume sensitive, because if you reduce your volume and you're dealing with a large PPV from your contract manufacturer, that's not an acceptable situation either. You need to be less exposed to risk, macroeconomic risk, political risk, supplier risk, and need to be, most importantly, insulated from risk with respect to customer taste. And I'm not talking about necessarily only consumers here, but your intermediaries that supposedly buy your product, who can say, you know what, I really don't want that particular volume, or I don't really want this particular mix. So you know how much you're going to sell totally, but you're not sure exactly how much you're going to sell specifically, otherwise known as forecasting. We'll cover that in a couple of slides. So the new model's got to be less exposed to risk, less volume sensitive, based on landed costs, so it's a little more economically rational, more secure if that's a concern for you, the IP, and much more flexible. So we wanted to do something called the last mile supply chain. What you're seeing over here is the supply chain that exists today, right? OEM talking largely to a contract manufacturer who's responsible for the component manufacturers, who does final configuration, gets the product into the country, and then these things are kind of stepchildren that people don't really think about, and they probably have multiple solutions or maybe they outsource it all to one person. But these are really, the gray boxes are in many ways stepchildren. They're not outsourced in some cases. They're just all kinds of hodgepodge solutions to the market piece of the supply chain, typically associated with service and spares. Now, let's make a subtle change to this. First of all, let's think of the supply chain in terms of a front-end, globalized piece, and a last-mile piece. Second, consider the impact of a very subtle change of moving the final configuration. I'm going to just repeat that for you. Moving the supply chain such that the final configuration is now done in market as opposed to in a globalized fashion. Third thing, having the ability to move component suppliers and to insert components in at any point in the supply chain is extremely powerful lever. It's a very powerful lever. We're going to talk about this in future webinars, but also further today, because it allows you to postpone configuration. It allows you to pick and choose when you're going to, where your component supplier is going to be located, how much power you're going to give to the contract manufacturer, so on and so forth. Third thing is put in place a tiered contract manufacturing supply base and begin to talk extensively to your component suppliers. I don't know if you caught that, but somehow we have to, I guess, maybe make this arrow jump up and down. But this arrow comes up, the one I'm circling right now, and then going to the tiered. So this offers a lot of subtle but very powerful advantages. There's a lot more control points and levers I just talked about. There's reduced, we lower landed costs because we're now configuring the product in market. We're lowering inventory because, again, we're configuring the product in market. We're reducing IP risk, especially if we design the product so that it's going to be configured this way. There's less IP that's required in the globalized piece. It's kept in market where you have much more IP protection, and you can actually separate. One point I want to make is that your global vendor is always different than your in-market vendor, and by putting a firewall, this dotted line between them, you actually separate the two and reduce your IP risk. You're obviously reducing geographic as well as supplier concentration because you're splitting vendor 1 here with vendor 2 over here, and you're giving yourself more flexibility. So that's and you then can have the ability to integrate all these stepchildren boxes, advanced replacement, warranties, demos, field engineering pools, distribution. You have the ability to integrate those into one vendor, and therefore, again, reduce your management hassle in market, but at the same time giving yourself more flexibility. I could go on about this for a long time, but just in the interest of time, if you want to speak about this and many of the subtleties of the last mile, I'd actually invite you to have a conversation with myself, Robert Mack, or any of the other people here at Extron to go into further detail on this last mile. So let's talk about this a little bit, whether it's working and how it's working. I'm going to go over a couple of actual case studies with you so that you can see exactly who has done this, what they've done, what kind of products, and what they've seen. So let's talk about this. The retail configurable mass storage device. It's got more than 10 SKUs, actually, in this case, almost 100 different SKUs. But for the practical purposes, 10 or more is enough. And let's talk about the challenges. This company was facing very volatile demand, poor forecasting, and high channel inventory. They actually owned the channel inventory because of price protection arrangements as an added twist. So inventory was actually very significant. Changing requirements from their distributors and retailers. But the basic SKU, I actually should emphasize this, the basic mass storage device came in 2 different configurations, but when you configured it, it resulted in over 10 different SKUs. So what they were doing is getting this product produced, packaged for overseas, trying to ship it in by container, but using air freight to manage the volatility. There was significant price erosion and obsolescence. And the key requirement was to preserve the global supply base. And again, I want to bring this thing again. It's very important to preserve that global supply base because nobody can change that today. But they needed to increase flexibility. So what they did was essentially adopt this last mile supply chain model with the following results. Inbound freight costs weighted when from a air freight base to sea freight and selective air freight and doing final configuration. When they did in the new model, the cost dropped dramatically. And this is a very dramatic drop. And the next example will show you not quite as dramatic, but still very significant. Here's the real big win. The order lead time dropped drastically. Stockout situation dropped drastically. Finished goods inventory, which is all basically forecasted, dropped 80% because all inventory is being held at a more flexible SKU level using classic postponement theory. And rework costs, which is trying to rework things, dropped from over $100,000 being completely eliminated because the supply chain built flexibility into it. Let's talk about a second example. A network appliance, a configurable that painted and eventually moved to a plastic enclosure that was just a small chassis with some metal, eventually moved to full non-conductive plastic. Multi-layer PCBA and I/O integrated into it. 4-threaded fasteners. A little bit of software put in, and that's actually a key part of the trick. Software was always changing. And, a number of configurations. Not hundreds in this case, but certainly close to a dozen configurations. Same issues as the previous case study, volatile demand, high freight costs. They were largely using container, having to use air freight a few times. The customers could not wait 6 weeks for their products, but at the same time, the company was really concerned about stocking too much inventory. There was heavy IP component to this because the technology they were concerned about technology, especially software being pilfered overseas. And the key was to provide preserve the global supply base. Here's what happened. Old model versus new model. The weighted freight cost went from 33 because of heavy air freight usage down to $6 a unit because printed circuit boards were now being flown in for flexible demand, and every other good was being brought in by ocean freight. Freight dropped dramatically, so this is the total weighted cost dropped to $6 a unit because there was some use of air freight, but only for the PCB. Other parts were coming in, the fully assembled units were coming in by ocean. Order lead time dropped from 2 months to 3 days because there was some finished goods here, but there was also the ability to configure domestically. Stockouts went from 40% to 10% and actually dropped considerably below that as the client over here figured out the model. And finished goods inventory was reduced 80% simply because they did not have to forecast necessarily the wrong model. There was some more rework in this situation, which this doesn't show, but the rework was also allowed the finished goods to be reduced 80%. So some other considerations. Jobs are a big deal. Companies like to have the ability to brag about them. I think there is a serious aspect to this that if we outsource all manufacturing jobs, it's hard to run an economy based on burger flippers. So socially responsible execs kind of like this idea. But I want to really point out this over here, economically justified jobs. These are economically justified jobs that we're talking about and not charitable jobs. This is not going out and finding your company's favorite charity and saying, we're going to sink money into this. You actually save money. You move from stage 3 to stage 4 by doing this. And so this creates domestic supply chain jobs. Second thing is this requires an openness to becoming pretty involved in your supply chain. So you got to be hands-on. You got to find a vendor. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer of us in the country right now. But you got to find people like that. You got to be involved in them. But I will tell you that for a company doing more than $50 million a year, the return on time invested is absolutely massive. The two people that one has to hire and results in the increased flexibility and reduced cost. The return on time invested is quite significant, but there's also ways to not hire people and still get the benefits of the last mile, and we can talk about that in the Q&A session or later. So implementation steps are fairly simple. Start small, prove the concept out to yourself, and then justify to your management. We find oftentimes the biggest proponents of this strategy happen to be CFOs. Start in one geography with one product line, and eventually, companies like Extron work the design postponement into your product. So there's a very deep side of this that we haven't even talked about, and we'll talk about those in the future webinars, about how you evaluate parts, how you select partners, how you design, change your design cycle, how you evaluate and build blended cost into your pricing model, and there's a whole series of discussions that we're going to have in those deep dives that we talked about earlier. So I trust that is, if there are any questions, we can take those in just the next couple of minutes. But this is an important takeaway from this. The implementation steps are start small, start in one geography, prove this out. This isn't something where you just, it's not as simple as outsourcing, where people outsource everything at one time and then dealt with the outcomes. This is a much more subtle change that involves rebuilding capabilities that have now been lost in your company. And so you need to have a partner that knows what they're doing and do so very slowly as you yourselves build up these capabilities. It's much easier to break down capabilities than it is to rebuild them. We're finding this consistently with our customers, and this is why we absolutely advocate the start small approach. Okay, I couldn't stress this enough. So, summary then. Supply chain globalizing trend has reached full extension. The pendulum has swung fully. It's beginning to swing back. Systematic changes have exposed these risks. We're talking about sourcing risk, IP leakage in some cases, cost issues, asset utilization issues, flexibility issues. Leading companies are thinking this architecture. I mentioned a couple of existing clients of our company that are thinking through this. And it's very important that if you don't want to get left behind, that you think about this architecture also and how it applies to your company. And Extron's senior consulting staff, which we typically do at no cost for our customers, would be happy to help you think through this and how the last mile architecture applies to your specific organization. This new last mile solution involves saving money, reducing inventory, so income statement and balance sheet impact, increasing flexibility in handling IP security issues. Very important, and we're not going to talk about this today because we simply don't have time, is improving fault tolerance, and it's easy to implement in stages. Future discussions will focus on very deep dives on how to implement, how to evaluate parts, how to evaluate partners, how to build transportation into your evaluation and implementation methodology, how you change your design cycle, and educate designers on designing for, we've all heard about DFM. Well, there's a new DF over here, and it's designing for supply chain efficiency. And we'll talk about those in future webinars. So with that, we will, I think the next point is questions and answers. And here's some information. This is how you can reach out to us at Extron. With that, I'll just turn it back over to Doug, and we can take any questions that might be out there.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Sandeep. That was a great webinar, and we're going to go to the Q&A section of the webinar at this point in time. We've got a few of them already stacked up here, and I'll start with the first one, and then if I could just have Sandeep take these on one by one, and let me know when you're ready for the next one after that. The first one comes from Satish. His question, it looks like more of a comment, if you could just comment on it, is you need to include the advantage of being green by reducing transocean export.
You're absolutely right, Satisha. This is not a. I've not been able to cover more than 10% of the last mile supply chain over here. I really couldn't get into it as much depth as I wanted to. We found that 40 minutes is about as much time as we get in a webinar, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and then people get 5 minutes to run to their next meeting. Pick up their iPads or whatever and run to their next meeting, laptops. So you're absolutely right. There's a huge green impact to this, and there was a sort of second bullet behind that socially responsible execs. This is not only about bringing jobs back. There's actually a huge green component because moving parts from air to ocean freight and basically doing the locatarian version of a supply chain is actually one of the key advantages of this. We just didn't get to cover it. It is covered actually in a future webinar, but probably not, not extensively, just in the interest of time. But I've only shared with you about 10 or 15% of the last mile supply chain model today.
That was good. It's a very interesting question too, given all the discussion around
green
business.
Yeah, you get green bragging rights too, not only job creation bragging rights.
Yeah. So the next question is, how is it different than postponement, just straight postponement that you might read about in articles and so forth today?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a very insightful question. A lot of companies are thinking about postponement, and some are doing it. I've mentioned that actually I think leaders in this industry are already moving to postponement. This is actually quite a bit more than postponement, and let me say a little bit why, right? So then I'm going to just need to flick back a few slides. Give me a second, guys. Postponement basically says you do your final configuration where your clients are, right? So if I was to look at postponement's going to say, I hope you all see this slide right now. Postponement's saying, do that. Well, the last mile, aside from what we're going to cover in future webinars, is quite different. It says, number one, you treat this dotted line as a vendor differentiator. Okay, so you don't implement postponement with the same vendor because you're exposing yourself to the same risks. You do a front end and you have a last mile provider, and your last mile provider does most of these things to make it easy for you to manage. Secondly, you move your components around so that you don't have IP risk, so you don't have control of your component suppliers by a contract manufacturer. I mean, I'm going to jump into another webinar a little bit right now briefly, but your component suppliers very often do have, I hate to tell you about this, but it's an open secret, there are kickbacks from large component suppliers to contract manufacturers. I know people that have done very well ebook products that you would all have heard about, and they found out and they moved away from their contract manufacturer because they found that there were kickbacks involved in the background. You can't have that kind of stuff if you're trying to compete on a level playing field. Third thing, you move down tiers, this tiered part. Fourth thing, you start managing your component suppliers, not only for the reason I mentioned, but also from an IP perspective. You firewall things. We haven't even talked about some of the design, the evaluation things that we're going to bring up in future webinars. So there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. This is way more than postponement, but it leans heavily on postponement. Postponement is a key part of this, but it's probably 20% of the model.
That's great. And I know you mentioned IP as part of that. That's the next webinar, right? Early December.
Yes, that's the next one. Yeah.
The next question is, doesn't moving final configuration away from contract manufacturing location make things more complicated? You're taking what was once together and you're splitting it apart, doesn't that mean the level of complexity increases?
Didn't quite get the question. If you wouldn't mind repeating that.
So if you're taking final configuration away from contract manufacturing, breaking those two things apart, now you have to manage two things. Doesn't that make life more complicated for?
Yes and no. It makes it more complicated. You do get more return. Third thing is that we advocate going to a last mile model, which means you actually pare down your vendor base in your domestic market. You outsource that to one or two people. That simplifies it. Secondly, if you ever try to forecast parts, this makes your forecasting life extremely simple.
Okay, very good. And there's another question. Which factors determine the optimum place in the supply chain to make the cut? In other words, what component parts to leave with the contract manufacturer, and where do you cut and do the final configuration? Where in the chain do you break that?
We will actually get into that in depth in another webinar, but basically what you do is you analyze every single part based on landed cost, based on IP risk. So there's a whole number of different things. You look at its obsolescence and price erosion. So there are many different things you do with each part to determine where in the supply chain that value gets added, or even where that step gets done, such as a assembly step. So I'll give you an example. We had a customer once that was adding power supplies in Asia. And the power supplies cost only less than $1, but the cost of flying them over was close to $8 a unit. So a very much simpler model would have been ship those in bulk, add them in over here. Even after you consider the cost of adding in a power supply, a few cents over here, more than free in the overseas market, you actually saved so much more on your transportation costs that it was a sensible decision to make. And then we have a simple matrix that determines whether these parts get added in a framework for analysis, which we'll cover in the future.
Good. And the next question is from Sanjay. Do you always have to move some of the component suppliers over to the last mile as part of the process?
No, absolutely not. Oftentimes, you will find that there are components that should be moved away. But again, through this analysis framework that we'll be presenting, I think in the January or February webinar, you actually get to analyze each component and figure out where exactly it should be postponed to. In other words, what's the appropriate economically justified postponement point when you consider cost of the part, transportation costs, in other words, the landed costs, obsolescence costs, and labor costs associated with the actual configuration point. So it's a fairly deep analysis.
Okay. And this one's from Satish again. What if my product's pretty simple and doesn't seem to need a lot of configuration? How do I take advantage of this new model if I don't have a lot of configuration?
What if my product is?
If there's not a lot of different parts,
Yeah.
I'm assuming it means if there's not a lot of parts.
Yeah. Actually, that's fine. You have to evaluate other. Configuration is only one part of the evaluation. There's cost. There's transportation. The product cost is transportation. There's labor associated with it. There's IP protection concerns. If your IP protection on a particular step is high, you change that. So there's a lot of other reasons. But in general, the less configuration you've got, that you reduce one variable, but there's 3 other variables that bear analysis. And it may just be that you've got that. Then there's also an implication on the reverse supply chain in terms of where you configure. So,
and I think we have time for one more question from Sanjay again. How long does it usually take to transition to the new structure? Is it something you do overnight, or does it take a long time to put all this in place?
That's a loaded question. It's not an easy thing. I mentioned that, and I hope I really re-emphasize that. It's much easier to break down manufacturing organizations to save a few $100,000 than it is to build it back up to save millions now. Now that we've become aware of all these concerns. But in general, I would say on the low end, without planning, it can be done depending if it's just a packaging-based configuration that we're talking about in as little as a couple of months. But to go full tilt on this, it takes years because you have to build up a real staff for that. So that is that's how I would say.
That's it for the questions that we have, and we're going to let you get back to your day. And we want to thank you for joining today's webinar. And we're going to have a recording of this. We made a recording as we went along. We'll have that up on the extroninc.com website. That's extroninc.com. Be sure to look for it there, and we hope you'll join us on the next webinars. Look for the upcoming email announcement for the Supply Chain Game Changers series of webinars, and the next one is going to be in early December for IP protection as part of the supply chain process. Again, thanks for joining us, and make it a great day. Take care.